Hello? Hi, this is a video going over the development of my entry for the 47th Ludum Dare Game Jam, an hour-long minute. I'll be discussing my thoughts regarding the 48 hours allotted for the compo, and some notable developments which took place. I recommend trying out the entry on its itch.io page before I begin, as I won't be going over everything. The link is in the video's description. Anyways, without further ado, let's dive in. Let's start with when the theme was announced, as that is when the timer truly started ticking down. The theme, to both the dismay and excitement of many, was stuck in a loop. Not the most creative thing in the world. Time loops have become a fairly bog standard and mainstream science fiction trope at this point, but I found it to be interesting regardless. This certainly wasn't the only direction one could take this theme. It is just how I decided to go about it. The only real problem I had was that I had no idea where to go with this. I started with no plan in place whatsoever, and so I spent some time simply doodling around in paint.net to try to get the creative juices flowing. Mostly just plotting little dots down, connecting them with lines, that sort of thing. This didn't seem to be doing the trick, and so I decided to just work on a reset screen instead. Something which would play when the loop was, well, looping over, as this would give me more time to think of the overarching mechanics to go with. The loop screen consisted of simply some text being typed in, akin to a typewriter, with a fade in and fade out before transitioning to the next room. While making the text, and after a good night's sleep, I decided what kind of story I wanted to go for. Now is a better time than never to explain it. Our cartel member, seeking to work with law enforcement after tensions in the organization rise, is slain by those he knew as close friends. This person's spirit, then either in revenge or to atone for past sins of some sort, would haunt the player, another cartel member, trapping them in a time loop. Later on, I decided to have the player character be someone in a similar situation as the now deceased gangster was in, working with the police and about to be executed, but then having the spirit decide to intervene to save him by giving the player infinite time to make their escape, even though there are hitmen arriving in 1 minute. I mostly went with this story simply due to the observation that you don't see mobster/gangster stories interweaved with time loops much, and I thought it would be cool. However, instead of making this story very explicit, it was hidden in cryptic messages in the loop reset screen. Here is a list of the possible sequences in the final product. These are meant to come from the viewpoint of multiple individuals, including the player, the spirit, and those antagonistic in both scenarios. I also made sure to word the sentences to sound as though something even stranger is taking place, constantly using the phrase "in the loop" to mean "in the group," or something akin to that, when it could be interpreted mysteriously. Well, that's about it for the story really. I just think it's good to have an actual story planned out, even if you're going to be explaining it in a vague and mysterious way. Anyways, let's get to the more technical side of development. I'm not sure of the exact moment it happened, but I decided to go with a 2D top-down view, which admittedly was a little lazy, but oh well, I needed all the time I could get in the 48 hours I had. As I was working on the loop screen, I decided to add a creepy sound in the background. Luckily, I knew exactly what to do. If you use the pulse stretch effect in Audacity and stretch out the audio, it becomes very creepy, especially if you layer it. Right now, what you are hearing in the background is pulse stretched into oblivion. It's quite creepy, isn't it? In fact, it worked out so well that I decided to keep it in to play throughout the entire game. I just used a text-to-speech generator online, the website number 2, and speech, to be more precise, and overlapped the two pulse-stretched results of
I won't let them get the same satisfaction they got out of offing you as they did me.
and
Get up, you narcs, come. I won't let you get out of this so easily.
to get the creepy background audio used in the final project, although turned down a bit as it was originally very loud. Okay, one last minor detail before getting into the more nitty-gritty. This will be quick. I used Paint.net for all of the art, and for the backgrounds I used its effect generation features, mostly involving Mandelbrot fractals and Crystallize. I think Crystallize looks really good. I've used it before in some other videos of mine for the background elements. I can't recommend Paint.net enough. It's a free program after all. Anyways, let's continue. When you first start the game, you are greeted by a phone call. I actually added the phone very early on, as I originally wanted it to be used to look outside the house, taking pictures with it, but since I was having trouble setting up a good menu system for the phone, I decided to just simplify it to simply being a tutorial device. I'm happy with the result, as not only can it be quickly turned off, but the voice on the other end of the call doesn't sound half bad either. Take a listen.
Listen to what I have to say and everything will be fine. The higher-ups have signed off on your execution. They know you are an NYPD informant. I reckon you have roughly 60 seconds before your door is kicked down. Do what you can to defend yourself. I won't let those scum do to you what they did to me. It may not seem like much time, but believe me when I say I have bestowed upon you all the time in the world. I know you are lacking in proper equipment. Try to use what you can find around you to get out of there. Good luck, my fellow dead man.
This was accomplished by generating some audio through the aforementioned website text-to-speech, and then applying the reverb, compression, and pitch change effects in Audacity. It might be a little incomprehensible at times, but there are captions for a reason, and it helps to set the mood. The other sounds in the game are either generated with Audacity's generation functions, or created from random stuff in my room. For example, I used a wrench for the sounds of the door handles jingling. It worked out very well. Take a listen. Okay, no more audio or art. Let's move on to the programming side of things. Pretty early on, I found myself cutting things to save time. For example, as I mentioned previously, additional phone functionality was scrapped after I had some trouble with it. You could originally toggle having the phone active or not, either pulling it up or down to use some apps. But I got sick of trying to set it up, and so I just pushed all of the unnecessary buttons off screen. They are actually still there in-game, but I believe shifted roughly 6,000 pixels away from the phone, so hopefully staying out of sight. Another nice improvement I decided to not set up was smoother turning for the player and enemies. It would have just used some relatively simple trigonometry to smoothly change an object's angle, but I wanted to avoid complicating things in case I had trouble with it later, and so the game has these choppy, instantly turning entities instead. If you watched my time-lapse video, you will see that about halfway through I began having a lot of trouble with the bullets enemies shoot. I was trying to have the bullet come out of the end of the gun that enemies carry in their sprite, but I was setting this up incorrectly, and so after spending well over an hour trying to fix this simple bug, I decided to just have the bullet spawn a few dozen pixels directly in front of where the enemy is facing, even if it wouldn't line up with the gun exactly. Luckily, the bullets travel far too quickly for this to be all that noticeable. The enemies themselves were thrown together very quickly. They consist of two states, which are whether or not the player has been found. If the player hasn't been found, the enemies simply pick a random point in the room every 3 seconds, and then attempt to wander to that point using some of the A-star pathfinding functions built into GameMaker. They will usually change points before reaching their target, and thus they move around quite a bit, although if the random point isn't valid, such as being within a wall, then they will continue along their previous path, so they can stop sometimes due to this. If the enemy has direct line of sight with the player as it is choosing a new random point, or if the player shoots their weapon, the player will be found. When the enemies have found the player, if there is no line of sight with the player, the enemies will set their movement target to the player's position. If the enemy and the player do have direct line of sight, the enemy will stop updating their movement target and begin shooting the player, having a 1 in 6 chance to shoot their gun every frame. The enemy will stop moving if they reach their target. Enemies will try not to shoot their allies, but the check I set up, consisting of a simple collision test from the enemy to the target, doesn't seem all that accurate, as the enemies will still fire at each other quite a bit. Now is a good time to introduce the stealth mechanics. The lights were added in very last minute, and the dark areas just consist of transparent black rectangles with points manually added in within the lamp object. You can even see them intersecting at certain points in-game. If a player is in a dark area, enemies instead have a 1 in 80 chance of shooting every frame, in addition having only a 1 in 100 chance of spotting the player if the player is in the dark while maintaining line of sight. This helps to make it difficult to predict the enemy's actions, and to ensure that stealth is not too overpowered. Enemies will drop their weapon when killed, the same weapon that the player can earn by unlocking the safe in the bottom corner of the house. Picking up additional weapons will give the player more ammo, and although this game isn't meant or designed to be a mindless shooter, you are not completely helpless, as you can take out an enemy if they get too close. The enemies have a 1 in 50 chance of losing the player when the player is in the dark, so as long as there are not a bunch of enemies around when this kill takes place, the player should be okay. Now, these enemies, they are made to mop the floor with your character, even if you have a weapon. You won't survive a direct assault, as the enemies have surprisingly effective predictive aim, shooting where you will be by the time their bullet reaches you. This, with their quick shooting, makes it nearly impossible to survive out in the open. Overall, I'm very happy with the predictive shooting, as this is the first time I've set up such a system. It mostly just involves LERP. The enemies can all be taken care of. I did it once just to see if it was possible, but it takes a while, as you need to make sure you don't get overwhelmed. The camera, if you've played the game you'll know, is meant to be disorienting. It originally was going to be much worse, zooming in and out even more and reacting slowly to the player's movements, essentially playing catch-up. However, as the time-lapse shows, I had a lot of trouble with this. The camera would just keep flying off into the distance, and so I scrapped that and just kept in the zooming effect. I'm almost glad I got rid of the additional disorientation though, as based on the feedback I received, it could have made gameplay less fun, and I don't think it was necessary. It is meant to give you a sense of dread and anxiety the player character is feeling, in addition to adding to the ominous atmosphere and mood. Nearing the deadline, I was running out of time to work on this game, and yet I still didn't have any additional gameplay elements outside of unlocking a safe by reading time-consuming notes on the ground. Because I was running out of time, I decided to go the route, although convoluted, of doing random stuff to unlock more stuff to escape, like you see in some other horror games. And so the game became more about quote-unquote puzzles. It essentially goes like this. First, you figure out a safe combination. Then, you retrieve the gun from the safe, and then shoot out the lights to reveal the correct face of toggleable symbols in the map, and then switch these symbols to the correct face. Finally, once all the symbols are displayed correctly, the oven in the middle of the map will turn on, and can be used to create a torch to burn down a barricade which leads to the exit. Spitting in the face of good programming paradigms the world over, I simply copy and pasted the code from the paperwork into other objects, which would also take time to do in-game, such as the oven. I also used the same code for displaying text. It all comes from the same object, an object which has had its innards torn out in a horrific and unnatural manner, spewed across multiple objects without reason. Please don't make the same mistake I made. Follow good object-oriented programming, as this led to some unforeseen consequences. I had wanted to add some additional ending types, or perhaps stars, at the end based on how you did, to give it a little more replay value. And I did start this with some of the stats displayed at the end, but I just didn't get around to finishing it. I do wish I added another ending for killing all of the intruders though. I could have done something creative there, but oh well. I am nearing the end of my ramble about this entry, but before I stop, let me just tell you about some of the nasty bugs which still reside within. Believe it or not, and this is where some of those unforeseen consequences begin to rear their ugly heads, but you can just open the exit door without having a torch to burn the wood down at the end. I forgot to add an actual check. It just updates the text. That's right, you can beat the game in under 10 seconds, with no effort. There are also some collision issues. Because I was lazy, the player's collision box is less a box and more just a single point on its origin, and so you can get very close to the walls. I've phased through walls a handful of times as well, and the junk debris that is near the exit can be walked around on the left side. You can walk right past it. That's about what I can think of. I don't know how many of you noticed this while playing, but you can hear the enemies making noises outside the house. I just added some delayed sounds which would play from behind the walls sometime after the game began or reset, and I think it makes it very creepy. It's a very similar setup to the enemies and how their spawn is set up. They are always there, only spawning in when a certain time has passed. In case your character is still around after a few minutes, I think after roughly 3 minutes, more enemies will spawn in, although it's not infinite. I know I have been rambling here, and I haven't talked about everything I could talk about. Actually, let's go over one last thing that is present but implemented poorly: the door deadlock. I'm sure many of you, actually most, didn't even notice these while playing. If you use these on one of the doors, you can have more time, roughly 2 more minutes before the door is kicked down. And if there were more puzzles to get through, then these would most certainly be used. But since the puzzles can all be gotten through just in time to avoid the enemies, the lock isn't necessary, and in fact takes time away from doing the puzzles, a major flaw since there is only one deadlock but 2 doors for enemies to enter. If I had more time to add more puzzle steps, then the deadlock would most certainly get more use, but as it currently stands, it is largely a vestigial feature. If there are any takeaways I can give from my time with this, it is to keep your scope very small, as a polished but lacking project is better than a broken one. Congratulations to everyone who took part in this game jam. I most certainly had a good time, and it has been fun seeing what others have made throughout the time allotted. I'm overall very happy with the final score. I'd say it averages out fairly well and fits with my own evaluation of the entry, what with it being very moody but quite unattractive to look at. The audio was surely what helped to give this a high rating and mood. I just hope you can all keep in mind that the score ultimately is not all that important. It is about having a finished game, and I think it could be fun to expand upon this, especially with some of the feedback I have received. I will make sure to take part in Ludum Dare 48 when the time comes, as this has been a good experience. I hope you enjoyed this video. It most certainly was a bit of a ramble, but I could see it showing some interesting thoughts. I plan on uploading more content similar to this soon, if anyone is interested in this sort of thing. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.